Haven Arrest Missionary Baptist Church presents Union Gospel Press's Sunday School Lesson number 3, Sunday, June 21st, 2020. The lesson is entitled, Gideon Defeats the Midianites. Lesson text comes from Judges chapter 7, verses 9 through 21. Related scriptures are Judges 7, 1 through 25, Isaiah 41, 10 through 14, 2 Chronicles 20, 14 through 17, Leviticus 26, 3 through 8. The place is near the hill of Moreh, and the time is 1191 BC. In last week's lesson, we saw that God often chooses the most unlikely people to accomplish his will. This week, we will also see that he sometimes puts these unlikely people in the most unlikely situations to succeed. Why does he do this? To demonstrate that the key to success is not to rely on our own human strengths and abilities, but to rely on his. God can take the weakest person, put him in the most difficult circumstances, and still bring him through victorious if that person will trust him completely. You may not have been class valedictorian or employee of the month. God can still use you in great ways if you will only trust him and do great things trust him to do great things through you. Today's aim, facts. To accept that God is able to use anyone who is willing to be faithful and obedient to him. Principle, to learn that the weakest person who trusts and obeys the Lord is stronger than the mightiest person who trusts in himself. Application, to know that even when we do not understand what God is doing, it is important to always trust him. Illustrating the lesson. Faith causes us to run to the Lord, but fear makes us run away from him. Practical points. 1. We can be confident in obeying God's commands because they are both for our good and for his glory. Judges 7, 9 through 13. 2. Our God will strengthen our faith during our time of testing as we rely on him. Verses 12 through 14. 3. Our faith is strengthened when we realize that God is in control. Verse 15. 4. Our commitment to the Lord assures us of ultimate victory over evil. Judges 7, 16 through 18, Psalms 23, 4. 5. God will fight for those who trust and obey his word. Judges 7, 19. 6. Satan's weapons cannot harm the righteous. Verses 20 through 21. Golden text. This is nothing else save the sword of Gideon, the son of Joash, a man of Israel, for into his hand have God delivered Midian and all the host. Judges 7:14. Today we have 3 lesson outlines. The first is God's promise of victory, coming from Judges 7, 9 through 14. The second is God's plan of attack, Judges 7, 15 through 18. The third is God's power, Judges 7, 19 through 21. Introduction. How many of the presidents of the United States can you name? Most of us Americans can name those who served during our lifetime and a few of the more famous ones. Beyond that, unless you are a history buff, names of many of the less prominent presidents cannot even be recalled. Even if you know their names, you probably cannot identify anything significant they did during their administrations. It is the same way with the judges. During this period of several hundred years of Israel's history, there were at least 12 different judges. Some of them are mentioned only briefly, and we know little about them. Others, however, are given considerable space by the writer, indicating their prominence in the narrative. As we saw in last week's lesson, the reluctant Gideon eventually responded to God's call, but this was not before asking for several signs to assure him that the Lord was actually with him. While his actions are sometimes promoted as a means to discern God's will, Judges 6, 36 through 40, it should be noted that Gideon's request For signs were not because of a strong faith, rather were made because his faith was weak. God's promise of victory. Judges 7:9. And it came to pass the same night that the Lord said unto him, Arise, get thee down unto the host, for I have delivered it unto thine hand. Verse 10. But if thou fear to go down, go thou with Phurah thy servant down to the host. Verse 11. And thou shalt hear what they said, and afterward shall thine hands be strengthened to go down unto the host. Then went he down with Phurah his servant unto the outside of the armed men that were in the host. Verse 12. And the Midianites and the Amalekites and all the children of the east lay along in the valley like grasshoppers for multitude, and their camels were without number, as the sand by the seaside for multitude. Verse 13. And when Gideon was come, behold, there was a man that told a dream unto his fellow, and said, Behold, I dreamed a dream, and lo, a cake of barley bread tumbled into the host of Midian, and came unto a tent, and smote it that it fell, and overturned it, that the tent lay along. Verse 14. And his fellow answered and said, This is nothing else save the sword of Gideon, the son of Joash, a man of Israel, for into his hand have God delivered Midian and all the host. Deliverance determined. Judges 7:9 through 10. Once convinced that God would deliver Israel from Midian by his hand, Gideon gathered a large army of some 32,000 men. Verses 3. While we might think he would have been commended for such efforts, the Lord actually told him, The people that are with thee are too many. Verse 2. God did not want Israel to conclude that it was by their own power or military strength that they defeated Midian. Consequently, the Lord wanted to reduce the number in Gideon's army. The first thing God told him to do was to let all the fearful men return home, and 22 of them did so. With the 10,000 remaining troops, Gideon may have wondered if that was a sufficient force to defeat the Midian. But again, God told him, The people are yet too many. Verse 4. Directing Gideon to take his men to a brook, God said, I will try them for thee there. Verse 4. While the precise significance of how the men drank the water is not stated, verses 5 through 6, it has been suggested that those who lifted their hands to their mouths to drink were more vigilant than thus making them better soldiers. Whatever conclusion we come to concerning how the men drank from the brook, we do know that God determined to secure victory using only 300 men he selected. If God could defeat Midian through an army less than 1% the size of the army Gideon started with, there would be no doubt that it was due to divine intervention, not human effort. We should never doubt what God can do with the few who are committed to him. The very night that after Gideon's army had been reduced to a fraction of what it had been, Gideon was given another sign, though this was one he had not requested. The Lord told Gideon to descend into the valley where Midian was camped. There he would be assured of ultimate victory. As the Lord said, I have delivered into thine hand. Judges 7:9. Knowing Gideon's propensity to fear, God told him to take his servant with him. Exactly how this would help we are not told, but as we all know, just having someone with us can bolster our courage in dangerous or difficult situation. Doubt dispelled. Judges 7:11 through 12. Gideon was going to hear something in the Midian camp that would strengthen his courage. For whatever reason, Gideon always seemed to need additional affirmation from the Lord that he was going to be victorious. While most of us probably think we need more courage, there is also the danger of overconfidence, possibly a sign we are trusting in our own strength, not God's. Being cautious can sometimes cause us to miss important opportunities, but being impulsive can lead to disastrous consequences. The Midianites and their allies had amassed a large army numbering 135,000. Judges 8:10. There were so many encamped in the valley that they are described as grasshoppers for multitude, 7:12, and as the sand by the seaside for multitude. Gideon and his servant came near to the Midian camp. Dream described, Judges 7:13 through 14. Considering what we already know about the large Midianite army versus Gideon's 300 divinely selected soldiers, some might conclude this was going to be a suicide mission. Of course, things were going to turn out quite differently from what might be expected from a human perspective. Overhearing a couple of the Midianite sentries, Gideon and his servant learned that Israel's victory had been predetermined by the Lord. One of the soldiers described a dream in which a cake of barley bread, verse 13, had tumbled into their camp and crushed a tent. Of course, in real life, a small piece of bread could not do much damage of any kind. Ancient people frequently saw dreams as a means of divine revelation. Even today, certain cultures place a high value on dreams and endeavor to interpret them. In fact, a number of times in Scripture, God used dreams to both warn and give guidance. In this case, God certainly used the dream of the Midianite soldier as a sign and an encouragement to Gideon. We must be extremely cautious about attributing dreams today to God. This is not God's normal means of revelation today. Hebrews 1:1 through 2. Immediately, the other soldier interpreted the dream as a sign of Gideon's defeat of Midian. This, the soldier said, was not because of Gideon's superior military force, but because God had ordained his victory. It appears this was a direct word from the Lord at that moment, but it is also possible this was the prevailing fear among Midian soldiers. If so, it indicates that their morale was already weakened. One thing is true of life in general and is equally true of the Christian life. If we conclude that defeat is inevitable, we are already defeated. God's plan of attack. Verse 15. And it was so, when Gideon heard the telling of the dream and the interpretation thereof, that he worshipped and returned into the host of Israel and said, Arise, for the Lord have delivered unto your hand the host of Midian. Verse 16. And he delivered the 300 men into three, and he divided the 300 men into 3 companies, and he put a trumpet in every man's hand with empty pitchers and lamps within the pitchers. Verse 17. And he said unto them, Look on me and do likewise, and behold, when I come to the outside of the camp, it shall be that as I do, so shall ye do. Verse 18. When I blow with the trumpet, and all that are with me, then blow ye the trumpets also on every side of all the camp, and say, The sword of the Lord and of Gideon. Interpretation accepted. Judges 7:15 through 16. Hearing both the dream and its interpretation emboldened Gideon. He now realized that victory was certain. This also led him to worship the Lord. The Hebrew word rendered worship means to bow down. While we are not told all this entailed, we can be fairly certain that it included both prayer and praise. Moreover, Gideon worshiped before he did anything else, a practice we would do well to emulate, especially once we realize what God wants us to do. With his faith bolstered by his visit to the enemy camp, Gideon returned to his men and called upon them to ready themselves for battle. He confidently told them, The Lord have delivered into your hand the host of Midian. Judges 7:15. The plan for victory was rather simple. Each soldier in Gideon's army was to take with him 3 objects, a trumpet, an empty pitcher or jar, and a lamp or torch within the pitcher. Since we are not told specifically whether God told him to do this, it is a matter of conjecture as to whose idea this was. Ultimately, however, it was part of God's larger plan for victory. Similarly, we may think something is our idea when it actually came from the Lord, either directly or indirectly. We are not told at this point why Gideon divided the 300 men into three companies. It eventually becomes clear, however, this was so they could surround and attack the Midianites from three different directions, giving the impressions they were greater in number than they actually were. Instructions offered, Judges 7:17 through 18. Though reluctant at the beginning, Gideon confidently took the reins of leadership of his rather small army. He told his troops they should follow his lead by doing what he did when they attacked Midian. Since Gideon was fearfully cautious in just about everything up to this point, it would be interesting to know exactly what his men were thinking. The soldiers may have been mystified as to the actual purpose of such unusual weapons, but their orders were to follow Gideon's example carefully. Obviously, the men who were with Gideon had not only volunteered for this mission, but also had been selected by the Lord for this battle. But even if they were the bravest men in Israel, they were severely outnumbered by the enemy. Surely they could not help but wonder about the numerical disparity between Midian's army and their own small force. Under normal circumstances, only one trumpet would accompany a contingent of troops. When Joshua conquered Jericho, only 7 trumpets were used, Joshua 6:6. The blowing of 300 trumpets would seem to indicate a very large army, quite the opposite of Gideon's troops. In addition to blowing the trumpets, the men were to shout, "The sword of the Lord and of Gideon," Judges 7:18. As military strategists know, the element of surprise is crucial. If the enemy knows when and where the attack is going to occur, they can be prepared. As military history reveals, there have been numerous surprise attacks that garnished significant victories for the attackers. God's power. Verse 19. So Gideon and the 100 men that were with him came unto the outside of the camp in the beginning of the middle watch. And they had been newly set the watch, and they blew the trumpets and brake the pictures that were in their hands. Verse 20. And the 3 companies blew the trumpets and brake the pictures and held the lamps in their left hands and the trumpets in their right hands to blow withal. And they cried, "The sword of the Lord and of Gideon." Verse 21. And they stood every man in his place round about the camp, and all the host ran and cried and fled. Trumpets blown. Judges 7:19. Generally speaking, ancient warfare was conducted during daylight hours with armies facing each other on the field of battle, as in the scene at the Valley of Elah, when David defeated Goliath, 1 Samuel 17:1 through 11. The Midianites undoubtedly thought that any battle with Gideon's army would come by daylight, if indeed they even expected a military encounter at all. Obviously, the Midianites still had to guard against a night attack or enemy probing, so they posted regular sentries. But the majority of their troops had gone to bed. It was during the middle of the night that Gideon began his attack, just after new sentries had been posted. Even if these men sensed that something was about to happen, the bulk of the Midianite army was fast asleep. As most of us know, being awakened in the middle of the night can be very discerning, whether it is from the ringing of the telephone or some unknown noise. Most of us cannot just jump out of bed and be ready to confront the unexpected, especially an intruder. Gideon's company followed his lead and blew their trumpets and broke the pictures in their hands. This was all part of the element of surprise to throw the Midianites into confusion. Triumph assured. Judges 7:20 through 21. Simultaneously, the 3 companies of Gideon's army did as their leader had done. The blowing of the trumpets awakened the Midianites. Hearing so many trumpets in their semi-conscious state led them to conclude that a vast army was attacking. The Israelites' main weapon was noise, and between the trumpet blast and the smashing of jars, they achieved the intended effect by demoralizing the Midianites. The purpose of the pictures was to conceal the light of their torches. Breaking the pictures also may have caused the Midianites to think the battle had begun. While the lamps would have provided light for Gideon's men, they also served to frighten the drowsy Midianites. Seeing the lights on three sides of their encampment, they would have concluded that they were surrounded by a large army. Hence, they were not only caught off guard, but also were tricked into believing they were under attack from a vast host. With Gideon's army standing firm in their positions, the Midianites simply ran and cried and fled, Judges 7:21. There was great confusion among those who did not immediately flee. Indeed, the Lord set every man's sword against his fellow, verse 22. Simply put, they started fighting each other. In darkness and confusion, they did not even know who the enemy was. With this initial success in putting the Midianites to flight, Gideon issued a call to arms to other Israelite tribes to pursue their enemies. In fact, some from Ephraim were angry because Gideon did not call them sooner, 8:1-3. Midian was defeated and Israel enjoyed some 40 years of peace, verse 28. Later, the Israelites wanted Gideon to rule over them as their king, verse 22. Wisely, Gideon rejected their request. He said, I will not rule over you, neither shall my son rule over you. The Lord shall rule over you, verse 23. This was what God wanted from the very beginning. While there were benefits in a centralized government, there would also be numerous problems. 1 Samuel 8:4-22. Even a cursory understanding of Israel's later monarchy reveals that there were far more bad kings than good ones. Even the best of Israel kings had their faults. This is still true with political leaders, whether elected or part of a royal dynasty. As someone has said, the best of men are only men at best. Questions. 1. What was the point of God earlier telling Gideon to reduce the size of his army? 2. Why do you think Gideon was fearful? 3. How are the Midianites and their allies described? 4. What was the substance of the dream of the Midianite century? 5. How was the soldier's dream interpreted? How did Gideon respond? 6. What items were given to each of Gideon's soldiers? 7. When did Gideon's troops attack? Why? 8. What happened in the camp of Midian when Israel attacked? 9. What were the long-term results of this battle? 10. What did the people later want Gideon to do? This concludes the Sunday School lesson for Sunday, June 21st, 2020. Thank you for listening. God bless.